Welcome everybody to Care Essentials, Responding to Behavior Changes. My name is Leslie Latchford and I'm a First Link Care Navigator and Support Counselor with the Alzheimer's Society. This session is one of 4 modules, so please look for the other 3 weeks in the series. This module will look at responding to behavior changes. Please have a pen and paper handy for both the self-reflection sections of this presentation, as well as to write down any questions that may arise for you throughout. Questions can be addressed by contacting your social worker at the Alzheimer's Society or by joining us at one of our monthly caregiver support group meetings. Keep in mind that this webinar isn't intended to replace the First Link Learning Series sessions that are offered in person at the Alzheimer's Society. Please consider registering for our in-person sessions when they again become available. Also note that this education presentation is for your knowledge building. As everyone's situation is unique, the information provided in this presentation is for educational purposes and not specific advice for your situation. Please visit our website at www.alzheimerlondon.ca for a staff list, as well as for information on upcoming support group meetings and other education webinars which may be of interest. Again, this module will look at responding to behavior changes. We're going to begin by talking about who the person with dementia is in your life. So when a person is diagnosed with dementia, there is a risk of beginning to see the diagnosis and lose sight of the person. As dementia progresses, it is important to remind yourself and be able to share with others who your family member or friend is as a whole unique person. So really important to focus less on the disease or the diagnosis, and important to focus on the person living with the disease. So important to focus on the person living with dementia. Unfortunately, there is a lot of stigma that comes with the diagnosis or as a result of receiving a diagnosis. And it's really important that we reframe our thinking and focus less on the disease and more on the person who is living with the disease. There's a link there to a short video clip. It's about 4 minutes, so I invite you to take a look if you'd like. And it highlights several individuals who are living with a diagnosis of dementia, and they talk about the impact that the stigma that they've experienced as a result of this diagnosis and the impact that that has had on their lives. So I invite you to take a look at this to hear some personal accounts. When we talk about the person living with dementia as a whole unique person, I wanted to share an example of a long-term care facility here in our area, and they specialize in dementia care. And you may have noticed if you visited a long-term care home, that outside of each room, there's typically a shadow box that includes some pictures of the individual and maybe a little write-up about that individual who resides in that room. At this facility, they have, outside of each person's room, they have a picture, several pictures of the individual, as well as quite a lengthy write-up about the individual who resides in that room. So they talk about the person's life history, what they did for employment, what their hobbies and interests were and are, who their family is and what's important to them. So it really gives you a sense of the whole person prior to any interaction with that individual, which helps to facilitate conversation and which just really gives you a sense of who this individual is as a person, and focusing on that and not focusing on, I'm going in to visit somebody with dementia, and focusing on that disease as opposed to the individual. So I find that really interesting to learn about individuals' life histories and life experiences and interests and hobbies and family prior to providing that interaction. So again, focusing on the person living with dementia and not the disease or the diagnosis. So I want you to think about who is the person living with dementia in your life. So I want you to write down 3 words that describe who the person living with dementia in your life is. So just take a moment to do that, or even just to think about 3 words that would describe the person living with dementia in your life. Okay, we're going to move on to talk about behavior and looking at this concept of reframing behavior and keeping in mind that all behavior has meaning. So it can help to understand that the person is responding in ways that make sense to them given the information their brain is telling them. Looking for clues about how the person might be interpreting the situation can help to accept what is happening and make changes that will be most effective if changes need to be made. So sometimes changes in a person's behavior because of the dementia can be difficult for the person and their care partners. Behaviors experienced will vary from person to person, and behaviors are usually a response to something. So there is often a trigger to the behavior that the person is experiencing, to their responsive behavior. Again, that concept that all behavior has meaning. Important to consider, though, whether or not the behavior is upsetting or a risk, and we'll talk a little bit more about risk as we move through this presentation, but whether or not the behavior is upsetting or a risk for the person or others, and if it isn't, thinking about, does anything need to be done? So keeping that in mind. So moving on to a little bit more self-reflection here. So what are some of the changes and behaviors that have been difficult for you or for the person living with dementia in your life? And thinking about what could be the meaning behind this behavior. And this may be an easier question for you to answer as we move through the presentation and look at some different framework. But just if you are struggling with some responsive behaviors, maybe write down or just think about what behaviors have been difficult for you or for the person living with dementia in your life, and what could the meaning behind this behavior be? Okay, we're going to define responsive behaviors. So responsive behaviors is a term originating from and preferred by persons with dementia that represents how their actions, words, gestures are a response, often intentional, to something important to them. Persons may use words, gestures, or actions to express something important about their personal, social, or physical environment. And I'll share a brief case example here. A doctor comes in to see a woman living in a long-term care home who has dementia. She has been complaining of stomach cramps. The doctor, who is in a hurry, rushes to her bedside, lifts up her top, and examines her stomach. The woman hits the doctor and starts screaming for him to leave. Her reaction is a normal response to the feeling of being threatened by someone who to her must have seemed a stranger trying to do harm. So perhaps for this individual, this is a responsive behavior that hasn't been present during her time living at this home, but the trigger of the doctor rushing in, being very hurried, not explaining what he is going to be doing to examine her. Perhaps he's not communicating appropriately for where she's at in her journey in terms of explaining, or for her to be able to understand what's going to be happening. And his actions of lifting up her shirt and pressing on her stomach leads her to respond in a physically aggressive way. So again, a trigger to this responsive behavior that she's experiencing in this situation that may not be present in other situations, okay? So that just puts it into a little bit of context, puts this definition into context for you. So on this slide, there are a few behaviors, a few responsive behaviors listed here. Certainly this is not a fulsome list, and I will provide you with a link to some resources that will provide you with more details on other types of responsive behaviors that may or may not be present in somebody living with dementia. But just to list a few here, so wandering, the signs may be that they walk away from home unattended with the risk of becoming lost. Restlessness, so the person may pace nervously or drum their fingers for long periods of time. The person may experience repeated actions, so they may repeat words or actions over and over again. Suspiciousness, so they may think others are trying to hurt them. They may accuse others of stealing possessions. Sexual behavior, so the person may be removing clothes or exposing him or herself. They may have physical or verbal advances towards others or self-touching in public. And aggression, so physical and emotional outbursts, for example, shouting, hitting, etc. We're going to come back to the risk piece in a minute, but I just want to move ahead in terms of identifying risks. So to put behaviors into perspective, it is important to think of how much risk is involved, and the following are serious risks that need to be addressed. Also important to consider how imminent is the risk, and is this risk increasing? So we look at things, risks such as roaming or wandering, imminent physical harm, fire, falls, frailty. Here we reference delirium or firearms, suicidal ideation, kinship or abusive relationships and neglect, or self-neglect, safe driving, and substance abuse. So again, looking at how imminent is the risk increasing? And when we revisit the previous slide, we can begin to identify for the individual if the behavior is present, what the signs are, and how you determine or what you determine the risk level for that behavior to be. And again, that's going to be different for each of you. An example of a repeated action. So I remember working with an individual who's with a care partner whose mom would constantly be washing and rewashing the recycling. So she would go out and pick up the recycling bin from the curb, bring it in and just wash it and rewash it and over again. So that was her repetitive action. And her daughter was quite uncomfortable with this. And when we talked about it, we talked about the fact that her mom is engaged in an activity that, yes, it may be distressing for her as the daughter, but her mom is in a safe environment. She's engaged in something that to her, she's obviously finding meaningful. And so it's just, the daughter had to kind of reframe her thinking around this particular behavior. And we referenced on the previous slide, is there something that needs to be done? Does the behavior need to be changed? And if the risk is quite low, then perhaps considering that it doesn't need to be changed. If the risk is high, so if you identify a behavior that is a risk level of 10, then certainly we need to look at how do we make the environment more safe for the individual, and how do we reduce the risk of this behavior, this responsive behavior from occurring. And that may become more clear again as we move through some of the frameworks. Okay, so in terms of problem-solving strategies, so think about the person with dementia, living with dementia in your life, and if they're experiencing a responsive behavior, what do you do? How do you typically respond? And what steps do you take? So think about a situation where the person with dementia in your life experienced a responsive behavior, and keep this in mind as we review the following two approaches to problem solving. So we're going to look at two frameworks that will help you in terms of perhaps even identifying triggers, identifying the responsive behavior itself, but also how to problem solve around and hopefully reduce or eliminate that behavior from occurring. So the first framework we're going to look at, or the first problem-solving model, is the ABC approach. So the A refers to the antecedents. So what was happening before the responsive behavior? And important to consider here, communication, the environment, the physical, disease, emotional, as well as the task, if the person is involved in a task or is not engaged in a task. So really important to look at, when did this happen? Where did it happen? Who was there? What was the person doing? What else was happening at the time? So what were the antecedents? What was happening before the responsive behavior? B is, of course, behavior. So what was the behavior? What was the response of the person? What did they say or do? And then C is the consequence. So what was the caregiver's response and what impact did it have? So what did you as the care partner say or do? How did you respond? And how did the person respond to this? So if you as a care partner were frustrated and responded in a tone that was maybe elevated, perhaps the person with dementia escalated as a result of how you interacted with that person, with your loved one. So again, considering your response and the impact that it had on the individual. So if we look at an example from a day program, let's say, where a particular participant was exit seeking immediately following lunch. So perhaps if we look at the antecedents, so we look at when did it happen? So it always happened after lunch. This wasn't happening at home, but it was only happening in the day program environment. Who was there? So typically a day program, there's other participants, there's staff, there's volunteers. So there can be a lot of people in the environment. What was the person doing? So perhaps after lunch, they weren't really engaged in any activities. They were just sort of sitting at their table with their other table mates, waiting for direction for afternoon programming. And what else was happening at the time? So perhaps there was, a lot of hustle and bustle in terms of the staff member cleaning up the tables, putting dishes away, getting prepared for the afternoon program. Perhaps there was staff coming and going for lunch, so staff changes. What else was happening at the time when this individual decided to get up from the table and exit seek? So the behavior in this situation or in this example would be that they were exit seeking. And what was the consequence? So how did the staff respond to that responsive behavior presented by the individual? Did they scold that individual? Did they recognize that perhaps this person was feeling some boredom and put a plan in place that after lunch or while the lunch is being cleaned up, that a staff or a volunteer would engage this individual in some activity, so in hopes of reducing or eliminating this responsive behavior or this need for this person to get up and exit seek? Or did they assign somebody to take this client or this participant for a walk after lunch? Perhaps the person just felt the need to walk, perhaps something that they did in their past when after lunch they went for a walk and that had been part of their past routine. So again, mapping this out and looking at what those antecedents were and how we responded to this behavior, and in hopes of reducing or eliminating this behavior from occurring, this responsive behavior from occurring. We're going to look at the PIECES framework. And so when trying to understand what is causing a responsive behavior from a person with dementia, it is important to look at the whole person and what is going on around them. Because each person is unique, we must consider the physical, the intellectual, the emotional, the capabilities, the environment, and the social. So this is a slide here of the PIECES wheel. So this is something that we would typically hand out in our in-person sessions. So this is the You First PIECES wheel that is a great tool in terms of providing detail on each of those pieces: the physical, the intellectual, the environment, the capabilities, the emotional, and the social aspects. And provides you with just a little bit more detail and some tips on how to manage some of these responsive behaviors if they are present. So if you are interested in a physical copy of this PIECES wheel, please reach out to your social worker and we can ensure that you receive one. So the You First wheel is a way to think through the different parts of the person to understand what may be causing behavior change and to find possible solutions. So we're just going to break it down here and look at each different piece of this framework. So we're going to consider first the physical. So what physical changes is the person experiencing? So are their basic needs met? Is there pain or discomfort? And we know for people living with dementia, especially as the disease progresses, their ability to identify pain it becomes more difficult. So oftentimes they're experiencing pain, but they're presenting with responsive behaviors as a result of this pain because they're not able to express where this pain is occurring for them. So important to consider the pain or discomfort. Are they experiencing any pain or discomfort? Is there any sensory impairment? So do they have an undiagnosed hearing loss or changes in their vision? Or are drugs or alcohol a factor? So we want to consider what we call the 5 Ds. So delirium, is there an acute delirium occurring? Is it just a result of their disease progression, or are there other diseases that they're experiencing that may be experiencing some changes in terms of the physical piece? Are they in discomfort? Again, that pain. And do they experience, or do they have a disability or a sensory impairment such as hearing or vision? So again, looking at the whole, that physical aspect. Intellectual, so what changes in memory, reasoning, speech, language, problem-solving ability, and judgment are happening? So is their dementia progressing? Are there more changes in memory happening for that individual? Is their short-term memory becoming more impaired, as well as perhaps their long-term memory is now becoming impaired as the disease progresses? Is there difficulty recognizing objects or people? So is this a change for the individual? Is their behavior becoming impulsive? Is the person forgetting how to do things? So is there functional decline? Is there difficulty thinking of the right word and understanding what is said? And is there difficulty focusing or shifting attention from one thing to another? So really considering that intellectual aspect and where that person is in their dementia journey. Also important to consider emotional. So what is the person feeling? Are there rapid mood swings? Is there an increase in tearfulness and anxiousness? Does the person have an undiagnosed depression or other type of disorder, such as disorder of personality? Is there evidence of boredom or loneliness? Is there a new behavior that seems unusual? Is there apathy or depression present? Again, is there an undiagnosed depression? So here we look at the 4 Ds, looking at disorder adjustment. So is this a responsive behavior that has just occurred as a result of a transition from home to long-term care? So are they having difficulty adjusting to their new environment, and as a result are presenting with some responsive behaviors? Is there a disorder of mood? So again, that undiagnosed depression. Are they experiencing delusions? Or is there another disorder, such as disorder of personality, perhaps, that has been undiagnosed as well? So considering that emotional aspect. Capabilities. So what are the person's strengths and capabilities? We referenced back in week 1, we talked a lot about the losses, so the 8 A's of dementia and the losses associated as the disease progresses. But then we also refocused and talked about the strengths and really that importance, the importance of focusing on the strengths and the capabilities that remain for that individual. And so in terms of capabilities, can this person do more or less than we realize? I worked with a lady who, her and her husband loved to do puzzles, and she was always doing, 1,000-piece puzzles, no problem. And that was something that she really enjoyed doing. As her dementia progresses, her husband had to slowly adapt to her capabilities in terms of adjusting the number of puzzle pieces puzzles that they were completing in terms of puzzle pieces. So, going from 1,000 pieces to a 750-piece puzzle to a 500-piece puzzle, because what was happening when she wasn't able to accomplish completing the puzzle, she would get very frustrated and irritated and angry because she wasn't able to complete a task and something that she had always enjoyed doing. As he adapted this activity to her capabilities as her dementia progressed, he saw less and less of that response because she was able to complete the task successfully and felt really good about being able to do that. Even though she may have only been completing a 20-piece puzzle, she was still able to complete it successfully. So again, focusing on, can the person do more or perhaps less than we realize, depending on where they're at in their dementia journey. Does this person no longer remember how to do the activity? And are they frustrated or frightened or don't know that they need help? And then when we look at the environment, so important to consider what is happening around the person. So is there too much distraction? So is there too much noise? Is there too much crowding? Is there too much clutter? Are the surroundings causing confusion? So are they in a new environment that is unfamiliar to them and therefore causing some increased confusion or perhaps some exit seeking? Is there poor lighting or can they not find their way? Is there not enough stimulation or is there too much stimulation? So really important to consider those environmental aspects. And then of course, looking at the social. So what is the person's social and cultural history? So what is this person's life story? What are their accomplishments? What are their interests? What are their hobbies? What are their education? What's their education? What's their work experience? And what personal items have meaning for them? Was their social network? Did they have a big social network? Were they more introverted and didn't engage socially as much as perhaps their spouse had hoped they would? Who are their family? Or who is their family? Who are their friends? What kind of neighborhood were they? Did they grow up in or come from? What's their cultural heritage? So what holidays were important to that individual? What were their rituals and traditions? And what types of food did they enjoy? So really important to consider that person's social history, and really knowing, the more you know about the individual, the more you can enhance those communication attempts, because you can engage in communication that is meaningful to them. So considering these frameworks that we just reviewed, the ABC and the pieces, how do these approaches compare to how you respond to challenges currently? And what would be useful to you about using each of these approaches? And perhaps mapping it out similar to how this slide is laid out. So thinking back to that situation that I had you identify earlier on in this module. So what was that situation that was challenging for you? And looking at the ABC model or the pieces framework and looking to identify the meaning behind the behavior, or what were the antecedents? What were the triggers that you can identify prior to the responsive behavior that was a challenge for you? And again, considering the physical, the intellectual, the emotional, the capabilities, the environment, and the social. So perhaps you and your loved one were at a wedding, and they started to present with some responsive behaviors. Perhaps they were, exit seeking or becoming very restless. Perhaps it was an environmental aspects. Perhaps there was too much noise. Perhaps there was too many people. Perhaps they were just not able to be comfortable in that situation, and therefore the behaviors became present. So really look at all of those aspects of the pieces framework, considering those antecedents and considering what is the meaning behind this behavior and what are those potential triggers for my loved one. Okay, I'm just gonna move on here and provide some strategies around some of the behaviors that we've referenced throughout this presentation. But again, keeping in mind that it's trial and error. So the individuality of solutions depend on the person. So remember to look at remaining abilities, strengths, and the situation. Strategies that work one day may not work the next, and understanding the behavior and being creative is key. So some strategies for wandering, again, looking for an immediate cause. So trying to just determine what those antecedents are or what those triggers are for the responsive behavior. Reassure the person and distract with another activity. So I heard from a gentleman earlier this week whose wife is constantly packing and wanting to leave. He's put up signs in his home in very clear language saying, "We are home, we are not going anywhere," in order to provide some reassurance to his wife when she gets quite anxious about wanting to pack up and leave the home. Distractions or trying to re-engage into another activity can often be an effective strategy. In many long-term care homes, you may see exit doors camouflaged with paint or wallpaper, or sometimes they have bookcases painted on the doors, or fish tanks or beach scenes, something that would lead individuals who are approaching it to not be able to identify that they are doors that they could exit from. So camouflaging those doors by various means. Perhaps the individual just needs to, burn some energy. So incorporating those regular walks into your routine, or exercising together, especially at a time where you know that the person is becoming perhaps more restless, incorporating some activities at those specific times will be important in terms of reducing or eliminating some responsive behavior. Putting reminders or triggers, what could potentially be triggers, out of sight. So things like coats, shoes. When we go outside, especially when the weather's not great, we put on our shoes and our coat, specifically our jackets in the winter. So removing those triggers may help to reduce or eliminate the behavior. Informing neighbors. So letting neighbors know in your immediate area, that there is that potential that the person that you're caring for may be out for a walk, may become disoriented or confused, and if so, to give you a call so that you can go and pick that person up. Registering with the Medical Alert Safely Home. So Medical Alert Safely Home is a bracelet. It looks like the Medical Alert bracelet. The printing is blue as opposed to red, has an identification number. So if the person is out walking or has exit seeked and becomes confused and somebody comes upon them, they're able to look at that bracelet, call in the identification number, and the person is able to be returned home safely. So Medical Alert Safely Home, there is a website there. You can certainly check that out. If you have questions about Medical Alert specifically, you can reach out to your social worker as well. Finding Your Way Ontario is another great resource that we have. This little booklet. Again, this is something we would hand out to you in person. So if you are interested in a physical copy of the booklet, please reach out to your social worker and we'll make sure that you get a copy. But great resource, findingyourwayontario.ca, has lots of great information about how to be proactive, as well as similar to this booklet, you can download information to have available in the event that your loved one does become lost and you have to involve the police. You've got identification, including a recent picture, which would help them in their search for your loved one. So again, if you'd like one of these, please reach out. Restlessness, so again, distraction, distract the person, find an activity that's meaningful for them, perhaps calm with music or touch. Pacing, consider pacing a form of exercise, so making sure that the way is clear so that there's no fall risks in the environment, that the person can continue to exert some of this energy perhaps, but in a safe environment. And look for patterns and arrange your schedule to be with the person at that time. So if possible, and you know that after lunch or later in the evening, if they're experiencing sundowning, that's when they tend to become restless, perhaps incorporating activities in at that time of day to hopefully reduce some of that those feelings of restlessness if they're engaged in another activity. I remember I'd been at a conference and someone had shared the example of a resident in long-term care who was quite restless and paced quite a bit up and down, a little bit of a disturbance to some of the other residents. And what they learned about this particular resident was that he was an eye doctor. So what they did was they set up a station next to the nursing station and provided him with all the supplies that he needed to clean glasses. So all other residents would walk by, give him their glasses, and he would clean them. So it was an activity that kept him engaged, and where he found value because it was part of his life history. So I thought that was a really neat example of knowing who this person was and providing them with activities that are meaningful to them. Repeated actions. So again, if the behavior doesn't cause any harm, then there's no need to do anything about it, essentially. And I can refer back to the example I provided with the lady that I worked with who was repeatedly cleaning her recycling. It wasn't causing any harm. She was engaged, and it was causing more stress for the daughter watching her mom doing this than it was to the individual who was completing this activity. So again, if it's not causing any harm, there's no need to change the behavior. Distract the person with simple activities. So if they, enjoy folding laundry, get a laundry basket full of towels, have your loved one fold them, dump them out, fold them again. Or polishing furniture or shoes. So activities where there is that repetitive motion. Change the subject or distract again, and lastly, stay calm, which I know is easier said than done when you're in these situations. But if you can, just take a deep breath and try to remain calm. Think about some of those strategies that we shared in I think it was week 4 of First Steps around caregiver stress. Hopefully they'll be helpful when you're in a situation where you're feeling a little bit frustrated and anxious as well in response to some of the behaviors that your loved one is experiencing. Suspicion, so provide comfort and validate emotions. Try not to argue or reason with the individual. We know that people with dementia lose that ability to reason, so we're no longer able to reason with them. So try not to argue or reason with the individual is very important. Try not to take accusations personally. Again, this is easier said than done when you're in the moment. And again, trying that distraction with another activity. I would advise too that if you are experiencing some responsive behaviors with your loved one and you're not sure how to cope or manage, please reach out to your social worker. They will be able to provide you with strategies and support around coping with these responsive behaviors. These are just very general strategies, and there's certainly lots more that could be tried, so please reach out. Sexual behaviors, so important not to judge or scold, perhaps providing some affection. Perhaps that's what they're needing in the moment is just a simple touch or a hug. Looking for unrelated needs. So if she's constantly pulling down her pants, perhaps she needs to use the washroom and just can no longer find that room in your home. Or are they too hot or too cold? So is the person constantly undressing in a certain environment because they're too hot and they're overdressed? Again, the distraction and providing privacy as well. Aggression, so important to remain calm and reassuring, looking for that immediate cause. So looking for that trigger, looking for that antecedent. And I can share another example. At a conference that I was at years ago, the presenter spoke about how he would go into a lot of long-term care homes to provide resources and support around residents who are experiencing responsive behaviors to the staff. And he said every time he would go on this one particular unit, this one resident would become very agitated, very verbally aggressive, almost physically aggressive in response to his presence. And so what they had determined in speaking with the family and learning more about this resident was that she had had a very bad experience in her past with a gentleman with a beard. And this gentleman had a beard. So that was her trigger, was just seeing this gentleman with a beard led to that responsive behavior, which wasn't present. The long-term care home had not seen this responsive behavior in this particular resident until this man was on the unit. So looking for those triggers is really important. Giving the person or providing that space to cool down, providing distraction if possible, and if you feel that your safety is threatened, remove yourself from the situation and call for help if needed. So there are a couple of resources that are linked here. So the first one is to the Alzheimer's Society of Canada's website, Conversations around Dementia and Responsive Behaviors. So provides you with some more detailed information around responsive behaviors. The Shifting Focus brochure as well. So this one is linked here for you. There, we do have a physical copy. Again, if you are interested, please reach out and we will have one sent to you. But again, it provides you with some more introduction or information on what are responsive behaviors, why do they happen, looking at the PIECES framework here, as well as some do's and don'ts for various types of behaviors, and provides you with some strategies and some testimonials as well. So this Shifting Focus brochure is linked here. So what you find in this brochure is found at the link there. Behavioral Supports Ontario is also a great resource, and I've linked their website there. So Behavioral Supports Ontario Ontario, or BSO as we refer to it. They will provide enhanced supports around responsive behaviors where there's imminent safety risks that are present for both the individual and the person caring for them. They will provide enhanced supports in the home environment and day program, and they're also embedded in long-term care homes. We do have BSO social workers and counselors at our Alzheimer's societies. So for those clients that come to us who, again, are experiencing some very challenging situations with their loved one, we do have those specialized workers with us here at the Alzheimer's Society, and can be referred to for that additional support if needed. So again, please reach out if you're struggling. There are lots of supports available for you to access, and reach out for those. Okay, so Module 4 will focus on supporting daily activities, and we will invite a therapeutic recreation specialist who will present different types of activities that you can engage your loved one with, some ideas for social engagement, as well as how to support daily activities for the person with dementia. Once again, our contact information here, 519-680-2404, and you can also visit us at www.alzheimerlondon.ca. Please reach out to your social worker if you have any questions from this module. Please visit the resources that have been linked throughout. And once again, thank you very much for watching. Take care.